Welcome back to the Wellbeing Podcast. Every episode is a step towards a healthier, happier you. Let's grow, thrive, and shine together. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the world of assumptions. Those mental shortcuts we take every day. We'll be exploring a podcast episode called Generations Unplugged to understand how these assumptions can impact our well-being.
It's interesting because we often think of assumptions as inherently bad, but they're actually a core function of our brains.
Like our brains are constantly trying to piece together a puzzle, even if we don't have all the pieces.
Exactly. It all comes down to something called heuristic thinking. Our brains are wired for efficiency, so they develop these mental shortcuts to process information quickly. Think of it like this. You're scrolling through social media and see a headline. Based on your past experiences and beliefs, you might instantly assume you know what the article is about without even clicking on it.
That makes total sense. Our brains are always looking for the fastest route. But what are the downsides of relying on these mental shortcuts?
Well, sometimes these shortcuts lead to assumptions that are just plain wrong. And when we act on those inaccurate assumptions, it can create stress, misunderstandings, and even conflict. For example, a study by Deloitte found that nearly half of employees experience stress due to assumptions made about their generation. These generational stereotypes, like entitled millennials or tech-averse boomers, can create real tension in the workplace.
That stat is pretty alarming. It's not just water cooler talk, it's actually impacting people's well-being. And I imagine these kinds of assumptions can show up in our personal lives too.
Absolutely. The American Psychological Association found that 60% of people reported relationship tension due to assumptions about their partner's feelings. It's so easy to jump to conclusions when we don't have all the information.
So far, assumptions sound like a recipe for disaster. But the outline you sent mentioned that they can also be useful. How is that possible?
It is a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Think about it this way. If you're meeting someone for the first time, it's generally helpful to assume they have good intentions. That assumption allows you to be open and build trust, which is essential for forming connections. Research from the University of Oxford even shows that people who make positive assumptions about others tend to have stronger social networks and experience less stress.
Okay, so it seems like assumptions can be both helpful and harmful. It all comes down to context and awareness. But let's go back to those generational assumptions for a moment. Why are they so prevalent? And how do they specifically impact our relationships at work?
Generational stereotypes are deeply ingrained in our culture. Each generation seems to inherit a set of labels. Lazy millennials, tech-addicted Gen Z, workaholic boomers. It's like we're automatically slotting people into boxes before we even get to know them as individuals.
And that can't be good for teamwork or productivity, especially in today's diverse workplaces.
You're right. A study by Bridgeworks found that a whopping 70% of workplace conflicts stem from generational misunderstandings. These stereotypes can lead to miscommunication, conflict, and ultimately a less productive and more stressful environment.
Can you paint a picture of how this might play out in a real-life scenario?
Imagine a baby boomer manager who prefers face-to-face communication and a millennial employee who's more comfortable with email or instant messaging. The manager might assume the millennial is being disrespectful or disengaged, while the millennial might perceive the manager as inflexible or out of touch. And without open communication, that small difference in communication styles can snowball into a much larger issue.
It's like they're speaking different languages.
Yeah.
So what does all of this research tell us about the overall impact of assumptions on our well-being?
Well, a study from the University of California found that a significant majority of people, 65%, feel increased stress when they're misunderstood because of assumptions.
And I wouldn't be surprised if that number is even higher when it comes to generational assumptions. We're constantly bombarded with messages about what each generation is supposedly like.
You're absolutely right. A Pew Research study found that over half of millennials and Gen Z believe that generational assumptions negatively impact their mental health. That's a huge portion of these generations feeling stressed and misunderstood.
So we've established that assumptions can have a significant impact on our well-being, both at work and in our personal lives. But before we spiral into a pit of negativity, let's talk solutions. What can we do to challenge these assumptions and create a more understanding and less stressful environment?
That's the million-dollar question. The good news is that we have the power to change our thinking patterns and break free from the grip of assumptions.
I love that. We have the power. So what are some practical strategies we can use to manage these assumptions and reduce stress?
The Generations Unplugged episode had some great tips. It all starts with hitting the pause button.
Wait, like literally freezing in place?
Not quite. It's more about pausing your thought process before jumping to conclusions. Ask yourself, what evidence do I have to support this assumption? It's about injecting a little mindfulness into our interactions and becoming more aware of those automatic judgments we're making.
So instead of letting our minds race ahead, we're taking a moment to check in with ourselves. That makes sense. But what happens when we're in a situation where we're genuinely unsure about someone's intentions or behavior? Do we just sit there and stew in our uncertainty?
That's where the power of asking questions comes in. Instead of assuming, we can simply ask for clarification. Replace assumptions with curiosity.
I'm already feeling less stressed just thinking about that. Instead of letting an assumption fester and create anxiety, we're taking control and seeking information. But let's be real, asking questions can feel intimidating, especially at work.
That's why it's so important to cultivate a culture of open communication. It's not just about individuals changing their habits. It's about creating an environment where people feel safe to ask questions without judgment.
So we're talking about building a workplace where curiosity and open dialogue are encouraged. That sounds amazing. But even when we do ask questions, our own biases and stereotypes can sometimes sneak in and cloud our judgment. How do we deal with that?
That's where empathy comes in. It's the ability to step into someone else's shoes and see the world from their perspective.
Empathy, I love that. But how do we actually practice empathy in a way that helps us challenge our assumptions?
It starts with recognizing that everyone has a story. Before you jump to a conclusion about someone's behavior, take a moment to consider their background, experiences, and the challenges they might be facing.
It's about remembering that people are more than just their actions. They're a product of their unique life journeys.
Exactly. And when we start to see people as individuals rather than stereotypes, our assumptions begin to lose their power.
This is so insightful. It's like we're rewiring our brains to be more compassionate and understanding.
It's a process, but it's definitely possible.
Okay, we've talked about pausing, asking questions, and practicing empathy. What's next on our journey towards conquering assumptions?
This one's a biggie. Challenging stereotypes.
This feels powerful. So we're not just acknowledging our own biases, we're actively working to dismantle them.
Exactly. It's about becoming aware of the stereotypes we hold, especially those related to generations or cultures, and consciously choosing to reject them.
We're becoming stereotype detectives, on the lookout for those limiting beliefs and ready to bust them wide open.
I love that. It's about recognizing that stereotypes are nothing more than oversimplified generalizations that don't reflect the richness and diversity of human experience.
So how do we go about challenging these stereotypes in our daily lives?
It all starts with education. We need to do our homework and learn about different cultures and generations, but it goes beyond just reading books or articles. It's about engaging with people from different backgrounds, listening to their stories, and seeking to understand their perspectives.
We're turning diversity into a learning opportunity rather than a source of division.
Exactly. When we embrace diversity and expose ourselves to different ways of thinking, our assumptions start to crumble.
I'm already feeling less stressed just thinking about all the amazing connections we can make when we let go of stereotypes.
It's incredibly liberating, isn't it?
Absolutely. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about pausing, asking questions, practicing empathy, and challenging stereotypes. What's the final piece of the puzzle when it comes to managing assumptions and reducing stress?
This one might seem obvious, but it's often the hardest to implement. Communicating openly.
Communication, the foundation of any healthy relationship.
Ah.
But how do we ensure that our communication is truly open and honest, especially when it comes to sensitive topics like assumptions and biases?
It starts with creating a safe space for dialogue.
Safe space. That
Here-
sounds cozy and inviting. So we're talking about an environment where people feel comfortable expressing themselves without fear of judgment.
Precisely. When we feel safe, we're more likely to be vulnerable, share our perspectives, and ask for clarification when we need it.
It's like we're building a fortress of trust where assumptions can't penetrate.
I love that. When we communicate openly and honestly, we create a foundation for understanding, collaboration, and reduced stress.
Wow, this has been such an insightful deep dive into the world of assumptions. We've learned that they can be both helpful shortcuts and sneaky stress inducers. But most importantly, we've discovered practical strategies for managing them and creating a more peaceful and fulfilling life.
It's all about awareness, intention, and a willingness to challenge our own thinking patterns.
It really does feel like a breath of fresh air when you realize you can shift your perspective and approach these situations with more awareness and intention.
It's about reclaiming your power and choosing how you want to show up in the world.
I like that.
Ah,
So before we move on, let's quickly recap some of the key points we've covered so far.
sounds good to me.
We started by exploring how our brains use assumptions as mental shortcuts to navigate a world overflowing with information. It's like our minds are constantly creating narratives even when we don't have the full picture.
And while those narratives can be helpful in some situations, they can also lead us down the wrong path, causing stress, misunderstandings, and conflict.
We saw how those assumptions play out in the workplace, with generational stereotypes leading to a whopping 70% of conflicts. That's a pretty stark reminder of how important it is to challenge those stereotypes and foster a more inclusive and understanding work environment.
And it's not just limited to the workplace. We also discussed how assumptions can create tension and conflict in our personal relationships, with that American Psychological Association study showing that 60% of people have experienced relationship issues because of assumptions.
It's like assuming we know what our partner is thinking or feeling without actually taking the time to communicate and understand their perspective.
Exactly. And that's where open and honest communication becomes so crucial. It's about creating a safe space where we can share our thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment.
That idea of a safe space really resonates with me. It's like building a sanctuary where assumptions can't survive.
It's about fostering a culture of curiosity, empathy, and respect, where we value diverse perspectives and seek to understand rather than judge.
And that sense of safety isn't just about the external environment. It's also about cultivating it within ourselves.
I'm curious to hear more about that.
Well, it's about developing that self-awareness to catch ourselves when we're making assumptions and having the courage to challenge those assumptions even when it feels uncomfortable.
That's a powerful insight. It's about taking ownership of our thoughts and recognizing that we have the power to choose how we respond to situations.
Exactly. We don't have to be prisoners of our assumptions.
Mm.
We can choose to pause, reflect, ask questions, and seek clarification instead of jumping to conclusions.
And when we do that, we create a ripple effect of understanding and compassion that extends beyond ourselves.
It's like planting seeds of empathy that can blossom into a more harmonious and fulfilling world.
What a beautiful image. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into the world of assumptions, what's the key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I want them to remember that they have the power to choose awareness over assumption, curiosity over judgment, and empathy over indifference.
And by making those choices, they can create a more peaceful and fulfilling life, not just for themselves, but for everyone around them.
What a powerful message.
Yeah.
This has been such an insightful and thought-provoking conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
The pleasure is all mine. I always enjoy exploring the complexities of the human mind.
Now, before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with a little challenge.
I love a good challenge. What is it?
Think about a recent situation where an assumption might have caused stress or misunderstanding.
So we're inviting our listeners to reflect on their personal experiences with assumptions.
Exactly. Once you've identified the situation, ask yourself, what was the assumption I made? What evidence did I have to support that assumption? How did that assumption impact my thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and what could I have done differently?
Those are powerful questions. By reflecting on our past experiences, we can gain valuable insights that will help us manage assumptions more effectively in the future.
It's all about learning and growing from our experiences. So, have you thought of a situation yet?
I have. Actually, just the other day, I was rushing to a meeting and saw a colleague walking towards me with a furrowed brow. I immediately assumed they were upset with me about something.
Oh, I've been there. It's so easy to personalize things, especially when we're already feeling stressed.
Exactly. But instead of letting that assumption fester, I decided to pause and ask what was on their mind. Turns out they were just preoccupied with a work deadline and weren't upset with me at all.
That's a great example of how pausing and asking a question can completely shift the dynamic of a situation.
Absolutely. It prevented a potential misunderstanding and saved me a lot of unnecessary anxiety.
What about you? Have you thought of a situation?
I have, and it involves a family gathering.
Oh, family gatherings. Those can be breeding grounds for assumptions.
Right, there's always a lot of history and unspoken expectations.
So what happened?
Well, my sister and I were planning a birthday party for our mom, and I was in charge of the decorations. I had a very specific vision in mind, but when I arrived at the venue, my sister had already started decorating, and it was completely different from what I had envisioned.
Oh no, that sounds stressful.
I immediately assumed she'd ignored my ideas and was trying to take over.
Did you say anything?
Not right away. I was stewing in my frustration and starting to feel resentful.
So what changed?
I remembered our conversation about pausing and challenging assumptions, so I took a deep breath and asked my sister about her decorating choices. Turns out she had found some amazing last-minute deals on decorations and was just trying to be helpful. She had no idea I had such a strong vision for the party.
It's amazing how a simple conversation can clear up so much misunderstanding.
It really is, and it reminded me of how important it is to give people the benefit of the doubt and assume positive intent.
I love that. So what did you do next?
We talked it through, laughed about the whole situation, and ended up collaborating on the decorations. It turned into a fun bonding experience, and the party was a huge success.
That's a great reminder that even when assumptions create tension, we can always choose to shift the narrative and create a more positive outcome.
Absolutely, and it all starts with awareness and a willingness to communicate openly and honestly.
So we've explored how assumptions can impact our relationships, both in the workplace and in our personal lives. We've also learned some practical strategies for challenging those assumptions and reducing stress. But there's one more area where assumptions can have a significant impact: high-pressure situations.
That's an interesting angle. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, think about a doctor in an emergency room. They often have to make life or death decisions based on limited information.
That's true. They have to rely on their training, experience, and intuition to quickly assess the situation and make the best possible call.
And in those moments, assumptions can be both helpful and potentially dangerous.
How so?
On the one hand, assumptions can help doctors streamline their decision-making process, allowing them to act quickly and efficiently when every second counts.
That makes sense. If they had to question every piece of information and analyze every possibility, it could delay treatment and potentially have negative consequences.
Exactly. But on the other hand, if those assumptions are inaccurate, it could lead to misdiagnoses or inappropriate treatment.
That's a sobering thought. It highlights the importance of balancing efficiency with accuracy in high-stakes situations.
It's a delicate balance, and it underscores the need for doctors to be aware of their own biases and assumptions, especially when dealing with patients from diverse backgrounds.
That's a crucial point. Biases and assumptions can creep into medical decision-making, potentially leading to health disparities and inequitable care.
It's a complex issue with no easy solutions, but it's a conversation that we need to be having.
I agree. We need to be talking about how to create a healthcare system that is both efficient and equitable, where assumptions are challenged and patients from all backgrounds receive the best possible care.
So we've seen how assumptions can play out in a variety of contexts, from the workplace to personal relationships to high-pressure situations. And while they can be helpful in some cases, they can also create significant stress and misunderstanding.
It all comes down to being aware of our assumptions, challenging them when necessary, and prioritizing open communication and empathy.
Those are powerful tools for creating a more fulfilling and harmonious life.
And a more just and equitable world.
I couldn't agree more. And with that, I think we've come to a natural starting point for this part of our deep dive.
It's been an incredible journey of exploration and self-reflection.
Before we move on to part 3, let's take a quick moment for our listeners to pause and reflect on everything we've discussed.
That's a great idea. Take a moment to consider how assumptions have shown up in your own life. What patterns have you noticed? What strategies resonate with you the most?
And most importantly, what one small step can you take today to challenge your assumptions and create a more positive and fulfilling experience for yourself and those around you? Welcome back to Wellbeing Podcast. I hope you had a chance to reflect on those questions.
Reflection is such a powerful tool for growth and self-awareness.
It really is, and it perfectly sets the stage for this final part of our deep dive. We've explored the impact of assumptions in various areas of life, but now I want to shift our focus to something a bit more philosophical.
I'm intrigued. Where are you taking us?
Well, I was thinking about how assumptions at their core are all about limiting beliefs. We assume we know the outcome, we assume we understand someone's motivations, and in doing so, we close ourselves off to new possibilities.
That's an insightful observation. When we operate from a place of assumption, we're essentially living in a self-imposed box.
Exactly. And that box can be pretty confining. It can prevent us from connecting with others authentically, from pursuing our dreams, and from experiencing the fullness of life.
So what's the antidote to this assumption-driven confinement?
I think it's about cultivating a mindset of curiosity and openness. What if instead of assuming we chose to question? Instead of judging, we chose to understand.
It's about approaching life with a beginner's mind, a willingness to see the world with fresh eyes.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective can be incredibly liberating. It opens us up to new possibilities, new relationships, and a whole new way of experiencing the world.
It's like we're stepping out of that confining box and into a vast, expansive landscape.
And in that landscape, anything is possible.
It's a beautiful vision, and it reminds me of that famous quote by Anais Nin, We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are.
That's so true. Our assumptions shape our perception of reality.
And by challenging those assumptions, we can literally change the way we see the world.
So what does this all mean for our well-being?
Well, I believe that challenging assumptions is the key to unlocking greater happiness, fulfillment, and peace of mind.
Oh, so
When we let go of limiting beliefs, we free ourselves from the stress and anxiety that comes with assuming the worst. We're able to approach situations with more optimism, resilience, and a sense of possibility.
it's like we're lightening our mental load.
Exactly. And that lightness allows us to be more present, more engaged, and more connected to ourselves and others.
It's about living with more intention and authenticity.
And that, I believe, is the essence of true well-being.
What a powerful insight. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of assumptions, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question.
I'm all ears.
What if challenging assumptions is not just about reducing stress, but about unlocking our full potential as human beings?
That's a profound question. It invites us to consider the transformative power of challenging our assumptions.
Exactly. When we question our assumptions, we open ourselves up to new possibilities, perspectives, and experiences.
It's like we're expanding our horizons and creating space for growth both individually and collectively.
And who knows? Maybe by challenging our assumptions, we can create a ripple effect of understanding and compassion that transforms the world around us.
That's a beautiful vision. A world where curiosity triumphs over judgment, empathy over indifference, and connection over division.
What a wonderful world that would be. And on that inspiring note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the fascinating world of assumptions.
It's been a journey of self-discovery, insightful research, and practical strategies for creating a more mindful and fulfilling life.
We've learned that assumptions can be both helpful shortcuts and sneaky stress inducers. And we discovered the power of pausing, asking questions, practicing empathy, challenging stereotypes, and communicating openly.
Remember, awareness is the first step toward change. By becoming more conscious of our assumptions, we can choose to respond to situations with more understanding, compassion, and intention.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Wellbeing Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and like the Wellbeing Podcast. Share your thoughts and let us know in the comments what topics you'd love to hear about in future episodes.
Thanks for listening to the Wellbeing Podcast. Take care, stay inspired, and see